Hey, welcome everyone to this episode of Smarter Sourcing. My name is John Pavia, and today we are joined by Ron Schnur from Utz Brands. He's the Senior Vice President and Chief Procurement Officer. Ron, thanks so much for joining us.
John, good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
So I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time, and for a reason that you're never going to guess. And in fact, we were talking before, and I didn't tell you. So I got to go back to the year. I think it was 2000, and I don't know, 2000, early 2000. I am at the Bloody Sock game with Curt Schilling for the Red Sox pitching against the Yankees. And out of 59,000 fans, I was the Utz fan of the day.
Oh my God.
And it was the American League Championship Series. It is an iconic game, especially for Red Sox fans, not Yankees. And I couldn't believe it. My seat number comes up on the screen. And so anyways, you owe me a car because I was the fan of the day. And it's the ALCS. It is a game that will live in infamy for everyone here in New York. And so I get called to come up to the security gate, and there's people waiting for me. There's a representative of Utz, and my prize for probably the biggest game of the year at Yankee Stadium was an oversized bag of Utz potato chips and a Yankee hat. And I even said to the young lady, I go, "Is there a set of keys in your pocket isn't there a car waiting outside?" So anyways, I love your brand.
It's a great brand and, 105-year-old company. So we've been around a long time.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. So listen, I could talk baseball with you forever, but I really want to hear about you, and that's what we're here for, and your background and how you got to Utz. So let's start off with your personal story, your own journey of how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I grew up outside of Pittsburgh in a small steel town, went through school, and, as I came out of college, my father had been in operations and logistics all of his life. And so, I think as I grew up, I kind of, like all kids probably, they see what their dad does, and sometimes they want to emulate what their dad does. And I came out of school, and way back when, John, what we call supply chain management today, we didn't call it supply chain management. We called it business logistics or materials management. And when I was picking a career, there were a couple industries that were really at the forefront of what we now call supply chain management. Some food companies, some technology companies, and some automotive companies, quite frankly. And I got really fortunate, I think, to join a company called Chrysler Corporation back in the day. And,
The Iacocca still there?
the Iacocca was there, all the people that had come from Ford. And it was one of the few companies that had what we called a rotational development program. So I was able to join the company and, spend some time in procurement and spend some time in transportation and spend some time in quality planning. And it gave me a really good foundation of what this thing we now call supply chain management was all about. And it was some really good times during the mid 80s when I joined Chrysler. We had come out of bankruptcy and we were, building some great cars. We had just bought AMC, which came with the Jeep brand. And so I got a really strong foundational experience there in the automotive industry. Fast forward, 15 or so years, and I came out to Colorado to run procurement for what was then Coors Brewing Company. So I transitioned out of what I'll call heavy manufacturing and automotive into food and beverage. And I've been in food and beverage ever since the last 23 years with some great companies. Spent some time at Coors Brewing Company that was merged with Molson, and then went to a company called White Wave Foods in a variety of supply chain roles. And how I landed at Utz is I was doing some consulting. I was consulting and had an engagement with them towards the end of 2022. And Howard Friedman, our CEO today, had just been announced as a new CEO. And so he was transitioning in while I was doing my, consulting engagement. And one thing led to another. And at some point in time, he asked me, and our COO at the time asked me, like, would you be interested in coming and working here full time and leading procurement? And I absolutely 100% was like all over it. Like, absolutely. Great company, great culture, great brands. Really like the leadership team and the vision that they were laying out for growing Utz. And I've never looked back. I'm so happy to be here.
That's awesome. I looked before, but I can't find it. What years were you at Chrysler?
I was there from 86 to 95.
So you're going to love this, and this is interviews about you, not me. But in 1987, I think it was 87. The whole world, well, the whole country is wondering if Lee Iacocca is going to run for president. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So at the time, I'm working for Bob Dole, Senator Bob Dole from Kansas, who did run for president that year. And that was the year that George Herbert Walker Bush gets the nomination and then goes on to win. Well, I have to go to the Capitol, and we're picking a senator up to go to some meeting. I was in law school, and I would do a lot of afternoon and evening things with him. And so the guy, Mike Laster, says, so, and we got an interesting meeting tonight. We go out to some country club in, I think, Virginia area, could have been Maryland, right outside of DC. And it was a secret meeting between Dole and Lee Iacocca.
Oh,
And
wow.
we got there first, and Mike and I waited outside in the entranceway, and I didn't know what the meeting was that I was going to. And then sure enough, car pulls up and Lee Iacocca gets out, and they spent the next 2 hours talking. We get back in the car, and as soon as we get in the car, the senator goes to us, well, he's not running. And the next day it was announced that he wasn't running. So it was pretty interesting. That was a pretty cool moment for me, 5 years old at the time, I think. So getting back to you, the car manufacturing and food, when you get the question, which you must have had over the years, sure, there's a lot of similarities, vendor management, redundancy, et cetera. What was the biggest difference that you had to adjust to going from one industry to the food, the car industry to the food industry?
Yeah, I would say supply market knowledge, right? So I went from, worrying about heavy metals and forgings and castings and transmission parts and, all things that come with sourcing to support manufacturing and automotive to now I'm dealing with growers, right? Now I'm dealing with barley growers and I'm dealing with hops growers when I went to Coors and then later at White Wave, I'm dealing with dairy farmers and all different types of feed commodities. So that I think was the biggest transition was, understanding the business and understanding the different supply markets. But you're absolutely right, John. What I would tell you is I think 90% of what we do in supply chain, I think, is transferable across industries. Great manufacturing processes and great sourcing processes and great planning processes. Great is great. It doesn't matter if you're planning for, making potato chips or you're planning for making beer or you're planning to make, automotive parts, right? So it was the supply market was probably the biggest learning curve for me.
So I'm interested in your decision to go into this career at a time when kids in school focusing on supply chain management wasn't that popular. And I was in college around the same time. Now, you grew up in Pittsburgh, around the Pittsburgh area. Your dad was involved with the steel industry. I went to Duquesne University and, loved Pittsburgh then and now. But and what I was looking forward to, and I said before that I was looking forward to this interview, is because so many people that I interview on this show, they ended up in supply chain management, sourcing, procurement, and it wasn't what they were thinking about when they were sitting around, drinking a beer back in college, their fraternity brothers, sorority sisters. But I'm curious, what was the impetus for you? Was it your dad? What was it that someone must have said to you, hey, this could be a great vocation for you? And more importantly, because you teach now, when you get that question from, and I teach at law school, so I get a lot of people who says, hey, my son wants to talk to you, he's thinking about going to law school. So you end up, I've had hundreds of conversations like that. What was the advice you got as to why this was an area that you should think about making as a vocation? And what's the advice that you give today when you get that same question?
I think what I came to really enjoy was the variety, right? When you think about an end-to-end supply chain, right? Plan, source, make, deliver. I mean, you're touching, all elements of how you run the business, right? From an integrated cross-functional perspective. And so, and you hear this a lot, like no 2 days are the same, but it was just the variety of issues and problems to solve and you're dealing with customers and you're dealing with suppliers and you're dealing with your own internal stakeholders and your own internal manufacturing partners, and I just really enjoyed the variety.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
Maybe you don't remember, but when maybe it was your dad and that he was in a business where supply chain was so important in steel industry, but do you remember because it's hard for me to get my head wrapped around I'm not saying it's so rare, but it is it was somewhat rare back in the early 80s for 18, 19-year-old kids to say, I'm going to take a bunch of courses in supply chain management. I would have said, what is supply chain management? So is there anything in particular that you said, yeah, that's maybe something I would be interested in?
Not anything in particular other than maybe the little bit of the influence of seeing my dad's career and what work he did. And, at the time I was a basketball official. I refereed high school basketball. And I always thought like, that whole mediation, you're kind of in that, conflict solutions environment as an official. And I just found that being in supply chain, you're constantly dealing with maybe some conflicting priorities, right? Cost versus growth, right? Make versus buy. And it seemed to just, land on me from a personal perspective. What I tell students today, if they ask, is again, I think it's the variety of all aspects of the business that you touch. And as supply chain has gotten more and more recognition over the years, you actually see some supply chain executives now becoming CEOs of large companies, right? Because it is such a you know integral part of how you make the products, how you ship the products, how you service customers. And so, when I started, there were no supply chain people that were ever CEOs, but now you've seen more and more of that happen. I will tell you, the person who ran supply chain and procurement for Chrysler for many years was a guy named Tom Stallkamp. When Daimler purchased or merged with Chrysler back in 1996 or whenever that happened, Tom Stallkamp was elevated as the president of the Daimler Chrysler business in North America. He was a supply chain person. So he was like one of the first that I recall getting elevated to that level of an organization. And he was a tried and true supply chain person.
I agree with you. I got to find a better way to, because I get this. I have 4 kids, and now they're all done with college. But with each one of them, I tried to pitch the idea of supply chain management and whatnot. I wasn't very good at it, but I think the industry has to figure a way to sell it better to 18-year-olds, right? Because, it's not something even I go back to the pandemic, and I remember, and everybody's talking about, the breakdown in the worldwide supply chain. And I think it was the first time that the average person was saying, so what is a supply chain? And, what does that even mean that it broke down? And I remember I had gone to speaking at something, and there was a Milton Friedman. You can see it on YouTube, and he talks about, he takes out a pencil, and he says, and he takes it out of a box, and he says it's like just like a number 2 pencil, and he says, let's talk about the amount of people in different businesses that were involved in creating this pencil, getting it into this box, and getting it on the shelf of some store that was bought, and to explain supply chain. And it was like, but most people don't even think about it. So that's why I thought it was fascinating. Now you teach it, and when I agree with you, you get involved in every aspect of the business when you're involved in supply chain management, sourcing, and procurement. As someone who spends a lot of time now with students of supply chain management, when you are practicing your craft of teaching, what is it that you're looking for in these students who you think, all right, this is someone who's really built for this industry, this career?
Yeah. There's a lot of different, obviously, characteristics, but I think as the world has continued to evolve, I talk a lot about curiosity. I just think you have to have a natural curiosity to not take the first answer to the question, or not take the first potential solution that you might come across as the best solution, right? So I tell students all the time, like when I'm hiring people or when I'm interviewing students, right, I expect Penn State or, any of these universities to teach them how to do Excel spreadsheets and some of the what we used to call the hard skills, right? I think the soft skills, right? The curiosity, the perseverance, the problem solving, critical thinking that students have, I think is so important, because I can't teach that, right? I can't teach curiosity. I can't teach someone that's going to, kind of persevere during a challenging situation. So that's kind of what I look for, and those are the kind of questions I ask students when I'm interviewing with them, like to probe just how naturally curious or, relentless or, assertive they can be in trying to work through issues and problem solve, because there's always going to be issues that we have to grind through and get through.
I wish I kept a tally of the amount of times I've asked that question and the amount of times I've gotten that answer. And I'm going to venture to guess that about a third of the time, to really seasoned, professionals, especially in this area, that is the most, I think, probably the most common answer that I get about, in this world of supply chain management, sourcing, procurement, you better be someone who enjoys finding an answer to something that you have no orientation in, or it's way outside your comfort zone, or solving a problem that's outside your comfort zone, and being naturally curious, because it's something that it's so, I think it's necessary in every facet of life, but especially in this one, because you do touch so many areas of the business. So with respect to where you're at today, when I think about Chrysler, and then I think about some of the things you did in between, because you were at a very established company, then you went to a company that was it Ripple, or what was
Yep, I was
what
with
was the
Ripple
product?
Foods
Yeah,
for a while. Yeah.
right. And so different climates, different companies at different stages in their development. One, very established, one, aggressive and trying to figure out how to grow. What do you think when you give advice on the difference in being part of those two different organizations, what do you tell people?
I thought about, my career as I was getting ready to talk to you. And, for whatever reason, John, I've gravitated to companies that were always kind of the up and coming companies. Think about Chrysler back in the mid 80s. We were nowhere near as large as General Motors or Ford or Toyota. So we had to approach things differently. We had to be edgy. We had to take some risk. We had to be kind of break some eggs to do things differently. And then I go to Coors Brewing Company, same thing. We're nowhere near the size of Miller or Anheuser-Busch. So how do we compete? What do we, what do we do from a culture perspective to compete against those companies that were 3, 4, 5, 6 times larger? I go to White Wave Foods, same thing. We are competing against Goliaths of the food industry and trying to carve out a niche in these new emerging categories like, plant-based milk or horizon organic milk, all these different categories that, White Wave, in many ways, I'll say, kind of help create those categories. And then I go to Ripple, which is a small, similar kind of company, but trying to fight against, bigger established companies. Now I'm at Utz Brands. We're a formidable competitor in the salty snack industry, but we're still relatively small compared to the competition. So I think about that and I say, what is it about those companies in my career path that I've been fortunate with, or that I've gravitated to? And I think I've gravitated to cultures that are wanting to take some risks, wanting to be a little bit edgier, wanting to do different things, right? Try different things, because we can't, we have to be able to punch above our weight class, if you will, right, in order to compete. And I just have found that those cultures I really enjoy. I like being part of companies that aren't afraid of taking risk or doing things, challenging the status quo, being a little bit, if you will, edgier in kind of how we look at new product development or innovation, or how we might leverage suppliers or contract manufacturers, right? I've just really been fortunate to, as I think back on my career, those are the kind of companies that I've gravitated to and have enjoyed, and in many cases have been part of some great successes.
Okay, so I know it wasn't Chrysler, but he has a role in the movie and in the story. Ford versus Ferrari. Liked it, loved it. One of your top 5 movies that you just can't resist watching again.
Oh, I loved it. I never met Carroll Shelby, but Carroll Shelby was a longtime friend of Lee Iacocca's, and they kept that relationship for many, many years past Ford. And again, that edginess and that, gumption that I think comes out in the Shelby and conversations. And then I'll always be a car guy at heart. I love cars. Again, I was very fortunate. I got some great foundational training and education at my time at Chrysler. So I'm always somewhat I have a soft spot for car movies, and that one struck home because, I can remember the competition between Ford and Chrysler. Iacocca came to Chrysler in 1979 or 80. He brought a lot of Ford people. There was a natural rivalry there, so it was I loved the movie.
I didn't know that until I saw the movie. I didn't know his history back with Ford. I love that movie, and I really enjoyed that movie and learned a lot in the movie. I mean, I love the scene where Ford gets, Matt Damon gets Ford to get in the car, and he pulls a fast one on the guy that was trying to run roughshod over him, and it's a hilarious scene. But that is a great movie. I figured, it's one of those movies that I'm sure you get yelled at because you watch and every time it's on, it's like, you got to watch it again.
Yeah, the part of the movie you don't know, there's obviously poetic license in these movies, but the part I really liked is when Shelby goes into Ford's office, and Henry Ford II, he was a king, right? He was a godlike person in the automotive industry, and the way they portray Shelby talking to Ford is he says, basically, you can't win races by committees, right? You can't, you got to have one person that's accountable and in charge. And again, I think back to, yeah, like that mindset, again, going back to my times at Chrysler, like, it was some great characters, if you will, that were leaders in the industry that were really pushing the envelope on what we needed to do to compete. And I just like that edginess, right? Some might say he was being cocky, but I think he was being direct and confident in what he was expressing to Henry Ford in that scene in that movie.
I know. I love that scene. Favorite car of all time that you've had?
Yeah, man, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a favorite. I like convertibles, so I've had a number of convertibles, and anytime I get into a convertible, and I live in Colorado, so we have a lot of sunny days. You just can't help but smiling, John. You put the top down and you're just cruising at 40 miles an hour in a backcountry road. You can't help but smile. So I like convertibles, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. All right. That's good. So let's go back to the industry today. And I go back to, I'm an undergrad and I'm coming to see you because I'm thinking about supply chain management as a graduate degree, which you got at Penn State. And if I'm a sophomore and I say to you, so I'm thinking about it. And if that's the path I go, what are the classes I should be taking now as a sophomore, freshman, sophomore, junior? Because the industry has changed a lot, and a lot of it has to do with technology. So what's the advice that you give someone like that?
I mean, obviously, to the extent that you can get some exposure to some of the emerging technologies that are out there, right? Obviously, AI is a hot topic right now, but I may have hinted to it earlier. One person a long time ago told me the action plan won't save you, the relationships will. And so, what that means to me is make sure you're taking classes where you have to do, I think, a lot of team work. Like, take classes where you have to do team projects, and take classes where you have to write papers and make presentations, because I think that so often, in order to be successful, you have to have the goods. You have to do good work and have sound data and recommendations and rationale for whatever it is you're trying to pitch. But you need to be able to communicate effectively to all levels of the organization, and you need to work with people at all levels of the organization. So I think, again, we back in the day we call it soft skills, but I really believe, you know, students, get that exposure to some of the emerging technologies, be familiar with the technologies, don't be afraid of, using the technologies. But man, take classes where you have to do team projects and you have to make presentations and you have to write business cases and you have to build those collaborative skills, because as soon as you land in UTS on day one, you're going to be working with people and you're going to need to influence them. You're going to need to convince them. You're going to have great listening skills and communication skills. And I think to some degree, we still undervalue those.
My follow-up question after you gave me the answer I expected was AI, data analytics, accounting 1 and 2, and cost accounting. But I was going to say that my next question was going to be, look, so much of the job is, vendor relations, treating your vendors as partners and not just, as vendors. But I love the way you jumped to it because I think, again, for kids in their 20s and 30s now, and I do think what I see is every young person in every organization I've been involved in over the last 25 years, the ones who get bumped up and identified as high potentials are the ones who are good communicators and can collaborate, work in a collaborative environment with other people, problem solve. And so I really enjoyed your answer. You also have gone through a series of mergers, acquisitions, et cetera, where especially I think in supply chain management, sourcing, procurement, it's so important to understand the importance of synergy and how to integrate. Because I'm sure I've seen some integrations where you're like they were textbook and they extracted more synergies than they ever did or ever imagined they would, and then you've seen a lot of bad ones where relationships break down, lines of communication break down. So what's your thoughts on that when you speak to somebody about the importance of understanding the importance of how to manage through integration?
When I was at White Wave Foods, I'll start there. When I was at White Wave, in the time that I was there, I think we acquired like 6 different companies. And I actually believe that the genius of our executive team at that point in time, as we went through those acquisitions, was one size didn't fit all. There were acquisitions where on day one, we started immediately working to, I'll say, integrate the company into the larger company in terms of how we bought things or their manufacturing footprint or the co-man network or, how we went to market or, customer relationships, right? Like we had a playbook and we just executed. There were some acquisitions, John, where the answer was, we don't need to integrate at this point in time. They got a great business. That's why we bought them. They have a great growth trajectory. They have a great plan that they're executing again. Let's have a soft touch with them, right? We'll be there to help them, or we'll be there to support if they have needs or questions or need some help. But like, we're not just going to smash them into our business on day one. I think that was genius because I've seen a lot of companies buy companies, and this is just Ron's opinion. Dang it, they're going to integrate them on day one. And 6 months later, or 9 months later, or 12 months later, it's like, what happened to the growth? What happened to the innovation? What happened to the supplier relationships? And so that's my story is you buy someone, obviously you want to drive synergies. You want to, extract the most value that you can, total value. But sometimes just one playbook isn't the right way to go. I think great leadership is around diagnosing what you just bought, understanding where you are in the kind of the maturation process, and sometimes maybe leaving it alone for a period of time might be the best answer in the short, medium, and long term.
Yeah. And let me have you add some my commentary, the relative importance of damaging a relationship with a vendor who you're not quite sure yet because this company that you've just acquired is new to you, but you don't really have an appreciation for how critical they are to the business. And I'm going to let you speak to that and just leave it at that.
Yeah, exactly. You don't know what's been going on with that company, that supplier, in terms of their innovation pipeline or what they've been providing that company in terms of, insight or information that company has been able to use to create a new category or to launch something faster than most, right? So, from my perspective, I think that too often we go for, we can go for the short win, which is, oh yeah, we'll combine this spend with this spend and we'll get this dollar value, and we're happy, right? We're good. And there are consequences to the choices you make. Sometimes you'll know, you might have an idea of what those consequences could be. Sometimes you don't, right? And again, in a growth business like Utz, or growth business where I've been in other places, like sometimes it's okay if you leave the extra nickel on the table at this point in time, because you're really focused on beating the competition to the marketplace with this new product. And so let the nickel go. We'll get the nickel in 3 months. We'll get the nickel in 6 months. Let's get let's get the beachhead for this new product on shelf, establish our presence in the market. And trust me, if we're successful with that product launch, or we're successful with that new innovation, we're going to make more than that nickel ever could provide us. And again, I have a couple examples that I am very passionate about, where the old school thinking procurement organization or supply chain organization would have missed the opportunity that came upon them had they been not really focused on total enterprise value, and only focused on kind of purchase price variance, or only focused on the acquisition cost of a label, or of an almond, or of a package.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more. I used to, back when I actually was a practicing attorney, in the importance of, especially in a situation where you're going through a transition, you're being acquired, you're acquiring, you're whatever it is, but defining what success is, what is, defining what great looks like. And I think this is where, in the world that you live, any supply chain professional worth their salt is going to say, look, it's not about buying at the lowest cost. Success is a vendor relationship where you're getting great value, and value is defined by lots of things beyond just the dollar signs. I was listening to a interview this morning on CNBC, and it was actually Walter Isaacson, who's former editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, did the big biography on Musk. And he was addressing the topic of how AI is going to displace so many different jobs, kinds of jobs. And so he said, look, I disagree with that. He goes, I think it's going to impact a lot of different jobs. But he goes, if you look at every advancement that we've ever made, yes, it impacts certain jobs, but then it creates different jobs that lend themselves to greater productivity. What do you think when you look in your crystal ball and you think about, companies like Daimler Chrysler, car companies, food companies like Utz? How do you think AI is going to really, what's the world going to look like in your world, 5, 10 years from now?
Yeah, we're trying to figure that out right now. I think there's a lot of smoke. I'm not sure how much fire there is, right? I think there are some applications today that can provide immediate benefit for, let's say, procurement organizations, right? Like, getting access to, let's say, supply market intelligence across, whether it's North America or across the globe, you know, AI and all of that technology explosion is allowing us to tap into some of that information in minutes, or maybe in days, right? Whereas I can tell you, the first time I was a commodity buyer back at Chrysler again, in order to really understand the supply market and what was going on in supply markets, like myself and my engineering partner and our quality partner, we spent like 3 months on the road, traveling all over the world, visiting all kinds of different suppliers to try to understand what was going on in a particular supply market, right? Today, I don't need to do that, right? I can probably gather that kind of information in, if not minutes, I can gather it in, maybe a matter of a week, right? So that's where it's really, I think, providing some benefit and impact today, and will continue to over the next, weeks, months, and years. What it looks like 5 years from now, I think we're trying to figure out, like, again, ROI, where's the biggest bang for the buck that we should invest in some of this advanced technology? Maybe it's customer facing stuff as opposed to supply facing stuff, right? And so, at all levels of our organization, our leadership team, we're trying to sort through, what's out there that can provide the biggest impact for our business and for our consumers and our customers. And then I think making, I would say, targeted investments, right? Like, being somewhat precise with where we want to place our bets.
We're gonna have a part two of this conversation. I'm gonna circle back with you because there's a lot more I want to talk to you about. And this is all the time we have for today. But I really enjoyed this conversation. We're gonna have another one and we'll get into more stuff. But have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us. I really enjoyed it.
John, my pleasure. Anytime you want to talk, I'm more than happy to. I enjoyed it as well, and have a great weekend.
Great. So to all of our listeners and viewers, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode of Smarter Sourcing. Take care.